All right, Bismillah. So, Deen podcast.
Yes.
I don't know what number
it
it is.
called?
No, it's so the funny backstory of this is it's actually called the Yasin Sharif podcast. Did I tell you the story?
No.
Okay, so
Yasin Sharif.
yeah, the Yasin Sharif podcast, and
like
so
that.
this is the backstory. So my dad's family's last name is Arshad,
Mhm.
and then my mother's family's last name is Sharif.
Yeah.
And so I was, for a long time, I was like, okay, how do I intersect? You know, I have interest in Deen, but then at the same time, if you SEO your name, it's always going to be under Yasin Arshad, and then like it's confusing, right? There's a confusion because totally different markets. And so the idea was that Yasin Arshad is going to be for the main content or the non-Muslim content, and then Yasin Sharif would be for, that'd be my mother's maiden name kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, and it kind of goes along because Yasin Sharif is the typical kind of desi, Yasin Sharif Parlo, and
Yeah,
that kind of
exactly,
stuff.
exactly.
And
That's the
so-
first thing I thought of when you said that. So.
Yeah. So it's technically under Yasin Sharif then. So,
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. That's
So
good to
I don't,
know.
but I haven't fully like figured out what the podcast
Yeah.
name is going to be. So, so we had a couple topics. So this is our first time talking about Deen stuff.
Yeah.
And since I think our relationship started over the course of the last like year or so, 2 years, it's primarily been around business because there's only a handful of people who are from our community who are talking about business or internet marketing and that kind of stuff. And so you and I were just always interested in that.
I remember the first time when we met was at a wedding, if I'm not mistaken. I think your Urshad had, which is another coincidence, by the way, obviously your last name. But I don't know if the viewers will know that. But anyway, I remember I think he or someone introduced me to you. And then like, I was shocked when you said digital marketing or internet marketing. And then like a few like terms flew out, like ClickFunnels and this or that. And I was like, no way, like this is crazy, you know?
He's brown and he knows what's going on here.
Because even when I go to, when I go to like, business conferences or masterminds or whatever, like, like there's like nobody, like Muslims or let's say even brown people for the most part, So it's always good to find someone that kind of has multiple touch points that you're familiar
Absolutely.
with. So.
And that's interesting because I think that your original background, from what I understand, was that, I mean, it was primarily in the Deen area. It's not like you're void of any Deen background and you like happen to be an internet marketer.
Yeah.
It's that, no, your original background comes from the kind of the Deen space, the Deen community. And I think you were at one point also, for a certain time period, you were the youth director or youth coordinator of Epic Masjid as well. And so you were involved with that whole scene for a while. And so the fact that both kind of main interests kind of aligned was interesting.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. So now because of that, so we've never actually talked about Deen, between the two of us. I think today's topic that I was interested in kind of diving into was I would say there's like I don't know if you want to call it a working theory, or there's a way that I look at the current status of Muslims that in my mind is the narrative that connects. Like for many years, I would look at, okay, different symptoms of what was the problems of the Muslim Ummah. And what took me many years to recognize was that there was an overarching umbrella of a disease, or disease might be a little bit too strong of a word, but an overarching kind of mindset that encompassed all of the different individual symptoms underneath it. And so that's kind of the argument that I want to lay out and get your potential thoughts on. So now, if you feel like you want to go off on a different tangent,
No, let's do it. That's the whole purpose of this thing, right? Is to talk about. I mean, so one thing I'll preface is like, and I was thinking about this when I was thinking like mentally, like preparing for this. Obviously, like there's no script. There's no like, okay, we're gonna talk about this specific thing. It was just in general. We knew we were talking about Deen and perhaps the problems of the ummah or whatever. So one thing I want to say is that I think it's very easy for two people like ourselves to sit here and talk about, oh yeah, these are problems, or this is a big problem, or what's the root problem, and then obviously do some analysis on that and try to see, okay, what the possible solutions are. But I think just a certain level of like I don't know, humility and just understanding that, okay, like, there's a lot of people trying to do a lot of good work. To be honest, I'm not doing anything compared to a lot of people out there, So so hopefully it's not just a discussion on theoretical or just hopefully it's something that practically we can do something about, whether it's ourselves or those who are watching. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that, before we get into it, I'm happy that you brought up that preface and the beginning of the premise as well, which is that there's a quote. some people have attributed to Albert Einstein. It's not necessarily the case. Thomas Jefferson said, and many people have said the same quote, which is the idea of if you have an hour to solve a problem, you spend the first 55 minutes figuring out what the actual problem is, like defining the problem, and then 5 minutes actually figuring out the solution. And so I think the conversation that, inshallah, if everything goes according to how we intend, is that it's more so around understanding what the actual problem is, because I think what ends up happening is that there's a lot of people, as you mentioned, doing a lot of amazing good work, and they're sacrificing huge amounts of, whether that be time, attention, effort, financial resources. And a lot of times, if you're focusing on the wrong problem, then you're kind of just turning your wheels and you're not really making a lot of progress.
Exactly.
And so I think that's been so. And just, I don't know if, have you ever talked about like each other's backgrounds as well in Deen? I don't know.
Not too much, no.
So like, I think just for context, I think this is important to reference, so that way I'm not just like some random guy coming out of nowhere just like breaking stuff.
Are you are some like hidden scholar or something?
Yeah, no, not in that sense.
Guys like studied for like 15 plus years.
I mean, the core of it is like I spent the first 10 years of my adult life in the Muslim community doing da'wah and teaching and halaqat and this kind of stuff. So I spent a decade plus in the multiple lives that I've kind of in business and stuff. Originally being from what I'm about to describe right now, and it's not in what we're going to talk about is not a. This is what's it's kind of like the typical people sit around the masjid after Isha Salah and talk about, oh, what's wrong with the ummah, and let's talk about that. No. I think what we're going to really talk about is at the heart of where does the mindset that we as Muslims have in today's world come from? Because once we can actually understand where it comes from, where it derives from, only then can we then figure out what the potential solutions might be. So that's kind of a little bit of a premise on
sounds
that.
good.
So okay, cool. So let's jump into
it. I'm excited to hear this.
Excited to hear the theory. Okay.
I'm also kind of scared, so we'll see. I might just have to walk out after this. There's no response.
I'm building up the suspense. It's like, we're like almost a couple minutes into this recording, and I'm building up the suspense, and be like, oh, it's just this. And you're like, oh, that was it. That wasn't that big of a deal. Okay, so. The theory works around the idea of paradigms and worldviews. And so what this has to do with is that in different seasons or eras of history, there comes big shifts of thinking that when you're in a bubble of a season of thinking, it's very hard to imagine how the world would be outside of that. Outside of that kind of bubble that you're in. So kind of give you a couple examples of this is that first and foremost, if you go back to like Galileo and like back when people used to think that the earth was the center of the universe, Galileo or whoever was attributed to, kind of popularizing the idea that the sun was the center of our universe was, put in jail because they were seen as like, a heretic and like, what are you talking about? The earth is the center of the universe. And so in that time, if you lived in that time in which the thought was predominantly around the Earth is the center of the universe, it would be impossible for you to even think of an alternative reality because of the fact that it's so prevalent that you're living in that world, right?
And interestingly, it's also, it's easy to assume that if we were living at that time, that we wouldn't be amongst those who are following the same train of thought as everybody else.
100%.
But once you're, anyway, so I just wanted to say that.
No, you're spot on. Because it's the same way, like even things that are going on right now. Right now I've made the stance that I'm not going to go into politics or geopolitics on this podcast. Sure. But I think that a lot of people, even what's going on in the world right now, people are like, oh, if I was alive when so-and-so atrocity was happening 100 years ago, I would be on the right side of history. Exactly. Or let's give it, because this is a Deen podcast. If I was alive in the Sahaba's time, I would definitely would have been one of them, for sure. Ghazwat al-Badr, I would have been one of those 300 would have been me for sure. So yeah, very, 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 very important point there. So that's one example. Another example that comes from, let's say, from physics is that for the long period of history, Newtonian physics was the way that people understood the world, right? And so Newton came up with Newtonian physics, right? And it kind of, obviously he didn't come up with all of it, but it kind of evolved, but it kind of became known as Newtonian physics. Once you were living in the concept of Newtonian physics, you could not imagine in which, how we define light and how we define, atomic particles and quantum physics and all these kinds of things. It would not have been possible for you to even imagine a world in which those things existed until Einstein came along, and all of a sudden he shattered the bubble. And now all of a sudden it became Einsteinian physics, right? And then obviously since then it's continued to evolve. So those are two examples that we gave from either Galileo's time or Newtonian and Einstein physics. Another example that you can look at is, for example, Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah, right? Is that he, for the longest time, early in his life was very much considered to be radical in his thinking, very much out there. He was very much considered, hey, you are rocking the boat of what is classical mainstream understanding of what Islam might be. Or even if you go before that, Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi, he was considered Ahlul Ra'i, which is that, okay, you are going to be not just take the hadith for what it is literally, you're going to actually infer based off what is the hadith. So that was considered like, oh, you can't do that. That's like,
most
terrible.
people are shocked about that one, actually, Imam Abu Hanifa, because like people think that now the majority of the ummah is supposedly Hanafi, and I've heard scholars who are open-minded and, let's say, forward-thinking, they will comment and say that the Hanafis of today have actually gone against the tradition of Imam Abu Hanifa, because he was always forward-thinking, open-minded, like you said, open to different paradigms. That was his tradition. That's who he was. But the Hanafi school over the centuries has developed into this very strict, almost like it has to be done this way. We don't accept other opinions and all this stuff, right? So it's like, that's not the tradition from the very beginning.
100%, right? And it kind of goes in like pendulums. It's like what starts off where Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, is rocking the boat. Fast forward 100, 200 years later, Ibn Taymiyyah becomes the boat. And then now all of a sudden there's somebody else who's going to rock the boat. Okay, so that's the first idea that we're kind of talking about, which is the idea of understanding how paradigm and thought bubbles exist. So my theory that I'm about to go into now actually revolves around my hypothesis that we are living in one of those thought bubbles that I think the vast majority of Muslims don't even recognize. Now let's look at actually what causes what are the inputs for the thought bubble that we live in today. So we are living now in the last 100 years, almost 100 years to this year, is the first time in Islamic history in which there has not been a khilafah. So 1923, Ottoman Empire collapses. Obviously there's been many khilafah that were existing. In fact, throughout history, there was sometimes even multiple khilafah that were going on, right? So it's been 100 years since then. In addition to that, we're living in an age in which we now have access to more knowledge as Muslims. The general population individual has access to knowledge that some of the most elite Sahaba, those who are Ashr al-Mubashirin fil Jannah, those who were the 10 promised Jannah, considered to be the elite of all the Sahaba, would not even have had access to around that ilm. I think some people have commented that the first year Aqidah student in Medina University can outsmart Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh in terms of the academic, quote unquote, memorization of knowledge that exists there. Okay, so these are different inputs, right? So we look at number one, the Khilafah has not existed for the last 100 years. Number two, we have access to more information than ever before. And so there's multiple inputs. But
by the way, just a quick thought. Sorry if I keep interrupting.
No, you're good. This is what makes podcasting awesome, is because you say you go like the back and forth is amazing. About it.
No, I think sometimes people will hear a statement like that. Oh, the current first year graduate, or let's say they complete the first year, they will have more information or academic knowledge, so to speak. And the reason we put quotes on it is basically the point I'm about to make, which is that if you say, okay, well, he has more than Umar radiallahu anh had, that almost sounds blasphemous, or like you're actually saying something insulting to Umar radiallahu anh. But I think hopefully the point, one of the points we're going to try to make, is that it's not about the information or the amount of it or the quantity of it, but I think it's going to be about other things, right? Or it's really about other things. But the problem is that when people get insulted by saying, oh, someone has more information than that person, that actually goes to one of the paradigms, which is the quantity over quantity type of thing, right?
Absolutely.
Where we think, oh yeah, just because someone has more knowledge or information that they are superior, when it's actually much
now,
different than that.
I think you're starting to get an idea of like kind of maybe where I'm headed in.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. We'll see though.
Okay,
it's gonna be, because if people don't know, this is the first time we're actually getting into this stuff.
Yeah, this is
we haven't talked about this before, so
this is nothing that we talked about.
It's gonna be interesting to see what things we actually have already in mind. Versus anyway.
Absolutely. So those are a couple of different inputs, and there's multiple inputs that we can get into. But let's now talk about what the outputs create. And so the outputs. And this is where I'm going to delineate between what I call, I've named the current Islamic paradigm as the transactional paradigm, or I'll call it also potentially the ritualistic paradigm. I sometimes also call it the checklist paradigm. I also call it you can call it the quantity over quality paradigm, whatever. These are multiple terms for this idea that I'm about to describe right now, is what I call the current paradigm of Islam. And that is going to be compared to the opposite, which is going to be what I call the taqwa paradigm of Islam. Okay, so we're going to delineate between those two. So let's talk about the transactional paradigm of Islam. So what happens when you give Muslims access to all of the information that is available, regardless of whether or not it is pertinent to their situations or not. What ends up happening is you then get this idea that the hasanat and the a'mal, that like the quantity of a'mal that I do is going to be the thing that is important. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean, now if you ask a Muslim point blank, maybe somebody who is practicing or learned, do you enter, this is like ABCs, most people would say like they know this one, which is, do you enter Jannah because of your amal? Obviously we know from the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha when she asked Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, no, even myself sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not enter Jannah except illa rahmatul alim, right? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if that is the case and we know that consciously, then why is it that everybody's optimizing around, okay, I'm going to do Ayyam al-Abyad 13, 14, 15. I'm going to read Surah Al-Kahf. I'm going to, read this sunnah. I'm going to do this. 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 And what ends up happening is you then have a massive checklist of everything I could potentially do. And what this then causes is two things. Number one, it causes people who can put up with that to go through the motions without actually, getting the fruits of them. And we'll talk about the fruits in just a second. And the second thing it does is for those people who cannot put up with this extreme amount of checklists that are required, they then get disenfranchised, they get desensitized from Islam altogether and say, man, this is just a whole bunch of actions and rules and all this stuff, and what's the point of any of this if you're not actually a good person?
Yeah.
Which is, and actually I think it was either this the previous podcast episode or one before that, where we were actually talking about how the percentage of Muslims who are quote unquote practicing compared to those who are not practicing, this entire bubble, even this podcast, even you and I, all of this that we're working in, is the 10 or 20% of people who even care about what Islam has to say. And then these unfortunately Muslims are acting as if we are the 100% of the Muslim population.
Exactly.
When in reality, the unfortunate truth is that the vast majority of Muslims are completely like, yo, that Muslim thing, those things that those religious folk do, like, no. We're very far from that. And so what ends
or
up,
they just can't relate to that, basically.
Yes, 100%. And so it ends up becoming this entire checklist of, that's where you get the brother who, mashallah, he starts to think that his beard is on point, he's fasting, he's doing this. There's a funny story I remember my sheikh told me. He's like, this brother, mashallah, he got the thobe, he got the beard, he got the siwak in his thing, he got everything perfect. He's praying 2 rak'at, and then he overhears some 2 brothers behind him saying, mashallah, look, the brother is, on point, everything. And then in the mid-salah, he turns around and he says, brothers, also, I'm fasting. If you don't know. And so it's just kind of like he has all the stuff.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately you hear that, oh, there's some quote unquote scandal that happened, or, how could this actually be? Or it's like as if there's like this celebrity kind of fandom that happens around putting this person on a pedestal. And then you realize he's actually just a human being who makes mistakes. And so all of that stems from, in my opinion, because of the fact that we are treating Islam in this current paradigm as a transactional element of, these are all the things I need to do because I know that this hadith approves this, hadith approves this, hadith approves this. So therefore, what's my entire to-do list of all the amal that I can do?
Right.
So that's kind of the first premise of it.
Yeah. No, so I have I guess an email / post I've written before, and it's called, it starts with a question, which is, do scales weigh or do they count? Okay. So the answer is, of course, scales weigh. They don't count. Yet the way we go about, our quote unquote Islam is as though the scales count, they don't weigh. Because count is the quantity, whereas the weight is the quality, right? So on the Day of Judgment, our deeds are not going to be counted. They're going to be weighed, right? That's a big difference.
Yeah.
Because that shifts the focus away from the quantity towards the quality. And of course, you referenced the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he said, "No one's going to enter paradise with his deeds, not even himself, except by the mercy of God or the grace of God." And so, I even, to take a step back from that, I always like to look at the Quran first and see what does God Himself in the primary revelation say, about this topic. So a couple of verses that come to mind is at the beginning of Surah Al-Kahf, Allah says, "Inna ja'alna ma'al al-ardi zinatan laha linabluwahum ayyuhum ahsanu amala." So he's basically saying that he made all of this entire world, whatever's on it, as a beautification or adornment, linabluwahum, to test them or to test you, أيهم, which of them, أحسن عملا, will be best in their actions, right? Better or best in their actions. Also at the beginning of Surah Al-Kahf, Surah Al-Mulk, there's a similar ayah as well. So the interesting part is the word أحسن عملا, not أكثر عملا, right? أكثر means whoever it does the most in deeds. But Allah said, God said, أيهم أحسن عملا, meaning which of them are the best in deeds, right? So, and then the classic example is like, let's just say you're at a fundraiser and, you have one person who basically is donating $10,000. It's a great amount. It's a large amount. Quantity-wise, it's huge. But then the person, intention-wise, in their heart, is doing it because he wants other people to think, oh, wow, this person's so amazing and he's donating so much and he's so righteous and blah, blah, blah. And then another person donates $10, right? But does it out of the full sincerity to do it for God only and for no other intention, no fame or no, whatever words from anybody else, So the question would be, well, which of them, earned more rewards, so to speak? Quantity-wise, clearly the 10,000 is way more than 10. However, reward-wise, the $10 out of full sincerity is way more than the 10,000. In fact, due to the the wrong intention or the bad intention of the person to seek from other than Allah recognition, that actually is not only not rewarded but potentially sinned, right? So you've actually gone a step backwards, forget a step forward, right? And so people understand these examples, but unfortunately when it comes to our sort of day-to-day prayers and whatever else that we do on a daily basis, it doesn't click as easily, So people don't think about this.
That's even where I get questions all the time. Like, I think from the sincerity of intention element of it, I think that most people would, on the surface say that, oh, being more sincere is better. I think that where I get a lot of pushback is when I'll have the controversial stance that you going and attending more halaqat is actually more detrimental to you. Now,
why would you say that though?
Yeah, so this is where I get the pushback, right? So let's kind of examine that a little bit more here. Is that I remember at one time this was years and years ago when I was still active in the deen scene. I was doing a halaqah in the tafsir of Surah Yusuf, right? And I remember probably we were like in like the 10th week of this halaqah series, and what happened was that we ended up I ended up doing a survey with the brothers who were there, and these were brothers who were like tulab al-ilm, and they're really on it and everything like that. And I then asked a very simple question. I said, hey, how many of you know the difference between Subhan Rabbil Azim and Subhan Rabbil A'la?
Yeah.
Right? Now, this is like the most ABC fundamental question, but in reality, if you look at how many of the people who are quote unquote, like on it in many other ways, don't even understand what necessarily the foundations might mean. Right. Okay, number two would then be that for every amount of ilm that you are accumulating, it actually, knowledge becomes a liability for you because you will be asked in the Day of Judgment, what did you actually do upon the ilm that you learned?
The accountability is greater. Yeah.
The accountability is greater. So on the surface, the idea of going out and attending and acquiring more ilm, and if I say that's actually probably doing more harm to you than benefit to you, it seems like a very controversial kind of like, hey, this is something that is very dangerous. You shouldn't be propagating this. And don't get me wrong, I'm not propagating this outside of the circles. In many ways, actually, and I should back up here to brief context here. It's very important to also understand, because we're recording and these kinds of things, is that this conversation is really a luxury that happens as a result of two individuals who are on the other end of the spectrum. We're coming from a very privileged place in which we spent our time doing the studies and going through the halaqat and these kinds of things. And so then in hindsight, we're saying these things. And so what I think is important to differentiate here, though, is that for the people who are quote unquote tulabul ilm, what they don't understand is that ilm, knowledge in today's world, and this goes back to the thought bubble thing paradigm that we said, has a very different meaning than what ilm actually meant in the Sahaba's time. You're talking about 1400 years. How much has the world changed in the last 1400 years? I think that people don't consciously recognize, because most people don't know history. Like, for example, when COVID happened, they were like, oh, alamat as-sa'a, Day of Judgment is happening. I was like, oh, you don't count the Spanish flu in which 2 million people, 1 million plus people died in the early 1900s. Like, there's many instances in which these things happen, but people don't recognize history. Is that the Sahaba's time, the idea of ilm was inherently tied to the concept of amal.
Yes, exactly.
There was no differentiation between the two. Now, what I think people don't recognize is that we live in a world, not just in the Muslim world, but also in the secular world, in which, let's say, for example, you're learning let's say you're learning something in math. And then you ask your teacher, hey, teacher, when am I ever going to use this in life? Teacher says, be quiet. It's for the test, right?
Yeah.
And so that same idea it has been also made its way into the Muslim community, which is we learn the ilm for the sake of learning the ilm.
Exactly.
And you could then also argue that this idea that we now have post-industrial revolution, where it's all about consumerism, because we have mass production of things that are being produced, that you're almost consuming an insane amount of ilm, right? If you want to take the kind of the food example of it, right? Yeah. You're consuming an insane amount of ilm, but the actual digestion and utilization of it is very lacking. And so you end up with people who are extremely, quote unquote, like horrendously obese, but from a ilm perspective, because of the fact that they've know so much, but then they, quote unquote, do so little.
Yes.
And so that's kind of the first part of it. Now let's talk about, I think, the second part of it, which I wanted to talk about, which is the taqwa paradigm.
Okay.
And
so
you want to go?
So I just a couple of So there's just so much there. Well, one gem that comes to mind is the dua in the Quran that's mentioned, Rabbi zidni ilma. Very interesting the way it's phrased. My Rabb is often translated as Lord. I like to translate it as like caring master, right? Either way, so Rabbi, my caring master or my Lord. Zidni ilma. It doesn't say, my Lord, increase my knowledge. It says increase me in knowledge, right? Meaning that it's like zidni, increase me through the knowledge that I get, right? Ilma. So it's very interesting that it's phrased like that. So we're not trying to look for increase in knowledge, but rather increase in ourselves through the knowledge, right? So it's very, very important.
The byproduct of the knowledge being the betterment of myself, right?
Exactly. The second point is that the knowledge that we're actually gaining, right? I think you alluded to it when you said the vast majority of people, Muslims, even those, let's just say the 10-20%, who are more serious, practicing, whatever. I don't like these sort of labels and words anyway, because there's just so much attached to it. But let's just say someone who's at least a bit serious and they're praying and whatnot. So I've sat at the masjid, right? So this is now the 1 to 5% of the 20%, okay, that actually are regular at the masjid. And I will ask the question, if I'm giving a short talk or whatever after the prayer, who knows the meaning of at-tahiyyatu lillah was-salawat wat-tayyibat, right? Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil Ala, those are a bit easier, right? So I choose something that is a bit more interesting. And unfortunately, maybe on average 5% of the audience will actually say yes I do, or they'll raise their hand, right? The shocking thing is that we all just prayed, okay? And we all just said at-tahiyyatu lillah was-salawatu tayyibat and so on 2 times, right? We just said this, but nobody knows what it means, or almost nobody knows what it means, right? That's shocking, right? To think that we are doing, so in the context of prayer, right? What is knowledge? That's the question. Knowledge to many people is, how do I pray? What are the motions? What do I need to say? What do I need to memorize? What invalidates my prayer? What invalidates my wudu? How do I, it's all focused for the most part, the way it's sort of taught today and talked about today. It's all based on the outwardly, right? And I literally just came across this random video on YouTube. The algorithm kicks in. So it was pray the way the Prophet prayed, right? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so not once, the entire video, he gave 14 points, okay? I was just I want to see, just out of curiosity, if he's going to say, you should understand what you're actually saying, okay? The only thing, there's one point on what you say, and he said the main point that he was emphasizing so much was it must be in Arabic. That's all it was. It wasn't, okay, now you need to understand what you're saying and feel a presence of heart and mind and actually feel a sense of what they call khushu', right? It wasn't about that. But it was the prayer to be valid needs to be in Arabic. You can't say it in English. You can't do this. You can't do that. It has to be this. Otherwise, your prayer is null and void. And so again, just going back to, and sorry, I'm going for so long.
You're good.
But knowledge is seen as these outwardly things. Very rarely have I heard people talk about how knowledge, again, like you said, it's essentially coincides with action, right? It is more about, do we actually even understand what we're saying? Do we actually even understand why we're raising our hands like this? Why we're holding our hands together? Why we're actually doing ruku' and sujood and these different positions? Why are we saying what we're saying? What's the significance and meaning behind it, right? Like that stuff is never talked about. And so even we talk about knowledge, even the knowledge that we're gaining is perhaps not even the right knowledge because it's not, and maybe, I mean, there's so much here to discuss, but it's like perhaps because the right knowledge, or let's just say the emphasis is not on what should be emphasized, and rather it's on this other stuff that should not necessarily be emphasized as much. Of course, that stuff is important, but so maybe because of that approach, it's that now the person is, let's say, lacking in the action because the knowledge was lacking in the first place in substance. It was just information or outwardly stuff, not actually inwardly stuff. So yeah, I mean, again, I could talk about this forever.
Because I think what you just laid out there was, I think, exactly the good segue to the second part here, which is, so we've talked about the current paradigm, right? We've talked about the transaction paradigm. And the reason I like to label these things is because when you label it, because words are just labeled thoughts. And so I think inherently many Muslims, I would say, maybe not most Muslims, many Muslims, when you start to label it, they start to recognize like, oh, okay, like they're like, it's not just this abstract, vague thing anymore. Right. You've actually labeled it as something, right? So
I love labels. I love frameworks. Yeah. So I've seen some of your training, so I love this stuff. So
yeah. So that's one paradigm. And then you compare that then to the other paradigm. Yeah. And this is where I'll call it the taqwa paradigm. I'll call it, I have a couple different words for it, but let's talk about what the basic premise of that taqwa paradigm.
So I do have some pushback on the name though.
Okay, right? That's fair.
The taqwa paradigm. So this is again a side point on the meaning thing,
that's
right?
Fair, yeah.
But the problem with calling one of them an English name, but the other one an Arabic, transliterated name or whatever, is an issue because I can guarantee you, even myself, many years ago, if you ask the average person what is taqwa,
100%,
they don't actually know what that means, absolutely. Right? Yeah. And so it goes back to the whole like meaning over meaning, just like not knowing, right?
Absolutely.
And how many, just broadly, how many times do people say words in Arabic that actually they don't even know what it means? Like one of my mentors, he was saying that, someone was thanking him for something. He said, Jazakallah so much, right? Jazakallah so much. So he pushed back and he said, what do you actually mean? Like, what did you actually just say, right? And sometimes, like, even with my daughter, who's 9 years old, like she'll say things that she's just used to saying, out of habit. But what are you actually saying, 100%. Right? So I try to make it a point, even with my kids, like when we're driving and we're saying Subhanallah sakhkhara lana hadha wa ma kunna lahu muqrinin, like I purposely in that moment will say, so what does that mean? And we actually say it in English and we also say it in Arabic, right? Absolutely. Because we sometimes assume, and I this bugs me a lot when khatibs, on Jummah, Friday prayer, the sermon, they're basically saying like, as we all know this story, right? Or like half of the khutbah is basically Arabic, like, even like simple things, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many Muslims don't know what that means. 100%. Allahu Akbar. Many Muslims will not know what that means, 100%. Right? Like 100%. We need to go back. So like when I'm speaking, I'll say God instead of Allah often. I'll say peace be upon him instead of sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? I'll say whatever else, like, common words, right? Like we can't, I think we just need to go back to the basics
100%.
Completely, because it's like, like that's the only, like we almost have to, like, these paradigms, basically we need to completely shift the paradigm and go back to the basics and build ourselves up. Like the foundations, it's like a house of cards basically, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The foundation is completely missing. So we're trying to build on top, and like you can't do that.
Yeah. And I think it was either Aristotle or Socrates or somebody who said, and it's attributed to them, but it's just a phrase, which is like the defining of terms is the beginning of wisdom, meaning that if you don't know the words that you're using, whether that be void of even the context of Islam or deen that we're talking about, even in the majority of life, if you're like, okay, we use terms, and we don't necessarily know, like, I failed, right? Okay, like the word failure is going to have a very specific emotional connection, because words are basically labeled thoughts and feelings.
Yes.
And so what you're doing is then you're going to literally feel things based off of how you think. And so how you speak is how you think. And so therefore defining the terms is very important. Now, the reason I call it the taqwa paradigm, we'll talk about now. I agree with you. If this was in a,
I hope you're not offended.
No, not offended at all. I think that's where the value of being able to talk about these concepts more regularly, especially in a recorded format, the way that we're doing, is because that then allows me to further refine it over and over and over again. And I agree with you that if this was going to be something that was going out to say, hey, I want this to be something that the vast majority of people that becomes accessible to them, then the term is not going to be readily available. So I think that the taqwa paradigm is more so for you and I to get an idea of it, and then we come up with another word or another term for it to be able to make it parallel to that.
By the way, I would just say that the majority of people, even though it's the 10 to 20%, the majority of those people will like. There's a principle that I try to follow when I write emails and when I like give talks or whatever. It's that. In two ways, and you know this as well, right? So in the marketing world and whatnot, you have to speak in terms of your vocabulary and just even sentence structure and whatnot at the level of basically like the lowest possible level, right?
Most people say third grade, something
exactly,
like that,
right? And so that's about 8 years old, 9 years old, kind of around that range, right? So you have to talk at that level, because if it's so that's one thing. Because if you can talk at that level, then basically you're essentially
your pool of people that you can speak to grows.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's an interesting study. There's an interesting thing about Donald Trump versus I think Hillary Clinton, and basically the way he spoke versus the way she spoke. Right. Hers was like at like maybe like a 8th grade level or something, and his was at like a 3rd, 4th grade level. Right. And like, just the fact that the vast majority of people, or a good number of people, can actually understand what he's saying, just because he's using smaller words in simpler language, right? That made a huge difference in the election, right? And then the second thing, so one is just the level of legibility, whatever you want to call it, or understanding. The second is more about basically meaning, right? So using words that people actually understand. So not just level of vocabulary or whatever, but actually using words that people understand. It kind of goes along, it's kind of the same point, but the principle is same thing. If you use words that you know the majority of people understand, then you capture everybody. Because the thing is, sometimes like what you kind of, I know you probably agree with me, but I think in general, sometimes we think that, oh, I'm talking to this person, so I'll use language that I assume that they'll understand. But then you'll only you're assuming that, number one, they're the only audience, right? But you're losing a lot of people. But if you speak to them in a way that the majority of people understand, they will all still understand you.
100%.
They might think, okay, well, this is a bit basic, but at least they'll still understand you. And then, a bunch of other people are still understanding you, right?
Absolutely.
So anyway, I think just, in our communication, our language, it's very important to be as sort of inclusive, let's just say, as possible.
I've been toying with this because, as you know, and this might take us on a segue, and then we've got to come back to the taqwa paradigm in a second, is that as I've been working on creating content, and this might go into a little bit of, maybe non-deen oriented talk here, but I think that the devil's avocado to that point is that there's a couple of things here. Number one, devil's avocado would be that if you are in the position in which you're creating content or you're creating material that has the need to be accessible. So for example, on the presidential candidate stage, you're appealing to the entire United States, right? Or so for example, if you're a khatib and you're going to speaking to the entire masjid, right? Yeah. But I think that if you look at people who, let me give you an example from a non-Muslim standpoint in terms of like Doctor, I don't know if you know, there's a guy on the internet, his name is Dr. Peter Attia. He's very scientific in the way, he's like a coach, he's a doctor, but he's like a educator about health. He doesn't dumb down his talks, and he's talking very scientifically, academically, because there's a specific concept in which he's being extremely specific on how to cover that material. And so I think that that's one point, is that to play devil's avocado, is that if you dumb down the language, then you, in some capacity, you are not, especially sometimes in an education capacity, raising people's standards to get to a certain point and say, hey, you don't understand it, but human beings also through context clues can figure out what the words are. Their further exposure to those words in an educational setting would allow them to actually level up their understanding, right? So I think that if it's for the purposes like we learn in internet marketing, copywriting, direct response, persuasion, and you're saying, okay, I need this message to be able to be understood to the vast majority of people, then yes, dumb down the language.
Yeah.
But what I'm starting to now think, because I was on the train for a very long time, I'm starting to now think is that if it's in an educational setting in which I'm going to be teaching a class, what I then do is then I will define the term maybe once, and then actually force the rest of the entire dialogue, or maybe even the rest of the semester, or even the rest of the training program, to force the usage of the new, more complex word, so that way it actually educates the person on, hey, I think you're a smart human being, and I'm not going to treat you like you're going to be an idiot for the rest of your life. And so I'm expecting you, as any serious academic, somebody in a serious, educational setting, expect you to better yourself, right? Yeah. Versus, I think that when you're trying to get a message out there and persuade the masses, you can't do that, because you have to. You're not educating the masses. Yeah. You're forcing them to, just understand your message in that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So.
No, I love that.
That's the double two sides of the coin kind of thing there. So anyways, let's get back to the other conversation we're talking about here. So taqwa paradigm. The taqwa paradigm essentially goes under the premise that you had laid out earlier, which was a good segue for that, which was, why are we doing the things that we are doing? And the taqwa paradigm sits under the umbrella. And the reason why it's called the taqwa paradigm is because every single tool that the current paradigm, the transactional paradigm individuals would be utilizing, siyam, salah, I'm going to read Surah Al-Kahf once a week, XYZ, right? All these different things that are on the table. So I want you to imagine like a table on here, and all these are different tools. Yeah. But what is the maqsad for, or the purpose for which each of these tools is fulfilling? Yeah. It's fulfilling the function of getting you closer to and building your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Exactly.
Now, in the Islamic context, I have a different theory called the taqwa theory. This is a whole different thing which we get into, which is that this taqwa, most people would class, and let me go into that a little bit, and then I'll kind of come back over here. Is that most people classify, unfortunately, mistranslate it. It was like, okay, taqwa, they would say is fear. Yeah. Majority of the time. Now some people are getting to the point where like, okay, it's God consciousness. Right. Okay, but if we look at the idea of taqwa, it's a very interesting concept because the closest example that I can give that people would understand what the idea of taqwa is that if you're driving your car and then a police car shows up behind you and all of a sudden you become hyper vigilant to literally how your big toe is on the accelerator, exactly going from like 31 miles an hour to 32 miles an hour. You are like you are not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about the past. You're not thinking about what you're going to eat when you get home. You're not thinking about, you've forgotten all of that. And you become so extremely present in the exact moment and become aware of everything that is going on in that moment simply because of the fact that you are now aware that potentially that police officer may be looking at you. Right. Because they're driving right behind you. Now, of course, lillahi al-mathal al-a'la, the best example is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not making parables here to connect it to, but it's a very similar example in that, similar, from Imam Nawawi's 40 hadith, the third or fourth hadith, that what is ihsan is that if you even the word worship, I'll use the word worship, I don't like the word worship, but we use it. You worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see him, and if you don't see him, then verily he subhanahu wa ta'ala sees you. And so the idea of taqwa is that if you are in the state of taqwa, it actually prevents you from being able to actually get lost in worrying about the future or having regret or getting worried about the past. And if that sounds familiar to maybe what the non-Muslim world talks about, you're right, because they talk about something called meditation to elicit similar results. And so the idea of meditation is to ground you in the present moment. And so therefore you become extremely conscious and can create a separation between the stimulus and the response. So I had a thought, I had an emotion, and my unconscious brain said, oh, I saw a cookie. Next thing I knew was in my mouth. I didn't even know the difference between the two because there's no separation there, right? Or, oh, I had this thought and I got angry. Or I had this, so what happens is there's a stimulus and the response, and then there's a space in between. When the two are together, you have a stimulus, something happens, and your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors are immediate. You're living reactively to exactly what's going on in the present moment. Versus the reason why they say meditation, what it does is it actually helps you strengthen your prefrontal cortex. And so meditation and the idea of being conscious, consciousness in the human brain, if you now go to neuroanatomy, comes from the prefrontal cortex, and unconsciousness comes from the rest of the part of the brain. And so you could make the argument, and I've kind of toyed with this idea for a long time. I was like, okay, you take somebody who is in like dhikr or somebody who's like in a state of taqwa, you put them in an fMRI machine and you see what their brain activity is going to look like. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever done it before. It's something that I would love to be able to do an experiment like that, because my hypothesis is that somebody who is in the state of taqwa is going to have more, and this is where now it becomes actually practical. It's not like, hey, let's just talk about woo. No. They're actually going to have more brain activity in their prefrontal cortex. And having more activity in your prefrontal cortex means that you're grounded in the present, which allows you to make better decisions, X, Y, Z. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. Because now let's return back to the taqwa paradigm, because that was a taqwa theory, okay? Yeah. Taqwa paradigm now.
You and your labels, man. The frameworks, crazy.
So if all these tools that we have on the table are tools to be able to put us into the state of taqwa. So the state of taqwa is in which we are extremely conscious. Because another thing that I told some brothers once and they really liked it was that you cannot have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if your mind is living in the future or if you're in the past. The only time in which you can become conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in the present moment.
Interesting, yeah.
Very fascinating, right? Because
I never thought about it like
that. So if you think about it in that context, taqwa only exists in the present moment. You have to become exactly the same thing. Like if I'm driving the car, the police officer pulls up behind me, you're not thinking about the future, not thinking about the past, you're thinking at that exact moment.
Right.
And so when you're in the state of taqwa, you're extremely cognizant of what your thoughts are, what your emotions are. You become what I call going into the observer mode, rather than riding the roller coaster of thoughts and emotions. Riding the roller coaster of thoughts and emotions is where 99% of people live the majority of their life, which is they're looping the exact same thoughts and emotions over and over and over again, versus being the observer of them. It doesn't mean that you negate the fact that you are going to have thoughts and emotions, but instead you become the observer of them. That is facilitated by the fact that you are in the state of taqwa because you are aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching you.
Yeah.
Now, once you get into that state, the reason why it's so beneficial is because it actually we can talk about it in an akhirah perspective, where in akhirah, of course, being in taqwa and then having more ta'ah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would lead you to have potentially better relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's good. Let's also then talk about the benefit that you would receive in the dunya as a result of being more in the state of taqwa. You would potentially have, this is where like I have like a funny, like a clickbait kind of thing, is like being in the state of taqwa is how you actually lose weight, make more money, have better relationships, have a better personal life, have a better professional life. Because of the fact that you are actually physically rewiring your brain to be more conscious. And so therefore, let's say for example, even the dua of, you might have to actually turn it off. Yeah, sure, because I think yeah, you're good. So the interesting point about this concept is that even you can look at the emphasis that Islam has on dhikr as a whole. What is the purpose of dhikr? The purpose of dhikr is a tool to be able to put you into the state of consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You get into the car, and the reason you read the dua safar is not like most people think they're going to protect me or something like that. In fact, there is no subhanallah, there's no like now that's where sometimes when I grew up they taught us to add on to the dua, fallahu khairun hafidhun wa huwa arhamur rahim, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of protectors. But the actual dua of safar has nothing to do with quote unquote protection. It's just glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and getting conscious of the fact that He has given you the ability to, you're riding, a car or whatever, you have the power to be able to control, right? All of these are just tools to get you into the state of taqwa. So then you could make the argument that Islam is the ultimate playbook to become the most conscious version of yourself, which would not only help you in akhirah, but also better your life in the dunya. And all of these are tools that our Creator has given us to be able to get into that state. And when you further compound this argument with the fact that human beings are actually the only creatures on the planet that have as well developed prefrontal cortexes, and if Islam is coming to actually strengthen your prefrontal cortex, and then we look at why Islam was revealed in the first place, is because without Islam, the argument that we as Muslims believe is that without Islam, Muslims would degenerate to the point of there's no difference between an animal and a human being, right? Because then you're just the facade that you have within the corruption that you have within the earth. And so Islam is the playbook that makes you the more conscious version of yourself, which then allows you to become the most best human being possible. There you go.
Dude, that's amazing, man. I love that. Yeah. I mean, that was a lot of the stuff that you just said, I had never thought about it from that paradigm. So there's just so much there to unpack. But let me think. So a couple of things that come to mind in terms of references, right? As you were talking about,
bro, mashallah, I gotta say, I wasn't expecting you to be the reference machine on the podcast, bro. Mashallah, you're just it's good, bro. The value that you get from the audience, because a lot of times when I'm thinking about the theoretical connecting of the dots, the references are the underpinning of which I'm thinking them, the lens of the framework of which I'm thinking them, because I'm not coming out and be like, yo, let me bring them some, da'if this or make something up. It's because after years and years of this, I had to understand what the framework of which I'm working within, right? Because you don't want to go outside the boundaries of usul. But they're not necessarily something that is coming to me directly in the moment of that's the reason why I'm thinking XYZ. But then when you come in and you just provide, further.
Well, we complement each other. Right?
Reference machine, mashallah.
Because you're coming from those same references, but you're just not necessarily stating them or whatever. So, no, yeah. So, I mean, and I think this is something that, the Prophet, peace be upon him, like his wife Aisha, radiallahu anha, she said that he was a walking Quran, And there's this famous example of a woman who apparently only spoke in Quranic verses, right? So I think the Quran is something that every believer and now we're seeing even with the current socio-political kind of situation that's happening, a lot of people are asking more questions about Islam and Quran, and they're going to this book, and many people are converting. The Quran is just incredible. Like I saw this video of this like elderly woman, man. Like elderly woman. She was probably like literally like 80s maybe, So she she had just converted after 80 plus years of not being a Muslim, of not being a believer. And she said, why didn't someone tell me about this book sooner? She had just read the Quran. She just started reading the Quran and she was like, this is the truth, It was just so self-evident. So I think the problem, one of the things is like we just as believers need to be connected to the Quran, so much so, and I'm not saying that I am, I am very little, and yet even that impacts me so much. Imagine if a person really truly immersed themselves into God's book, God's revelation, His words. Allah says that everything, inna fi dhalika la ayat, like in everything around us are signs, because everything around us, when we see those things, it's the usage of the word ayah or ayat is interesting, because we call ayat like verses of the Quran, but ayat is a lot refers to everything around us in the universe, in the world. It's interesting that both words are the same, or refer to these things, because it ultimately it's bringing you back to God, right? God's words, God's signs, it's all together. Anyway, so going back to the reference that I was mentioning, so the Hadith Qudsi, very famous Hadith Qudsi, right? In which the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that God said that my servant doesn't draw closer to me with anything except through, number one, the obligations, the obligatory things. And I heard something really beautiful recently, because essentially the word fara'id or fard is something that we commonly translate as obligation. And someone said that word has somewhat of a negative association, because we don't like to, it's like, oh, I already have so many obligations, now here's another obligation. So I like the translation he gave. He said the word fard is better to be translated as essential. So not obligatory, but essential, right? Because essential is like when a trainer tells you, oh, you need to do this 5 times a day, for example, to keep your health in check. Otherwise, your body will get unhealthy and you might die or get disease or whatever, right? So the trainer is telling you that not to put an additional burden on you, but rather to protect you and to save you, right? And obviously there are benefits too. But anyway, so the point is that sometimes we think of even fara'id as obligations, like burdens, right? If
we take a segue off of that real quick, if you don't mind, is that this is another topic that is kind of a offshoot of this, is that I can, as I grow older and older, if I was to bet, of course, there's Muslim podcasts bet, but if I was to if I was to make a guess on how humans are more likely to behave, they're more likely to behave in line with how human beings behave, right? It's less likely that you're
shocking
statement, right? Shocking.
Humans will behave like humans.
So then the question then becomes is that why do then those people who the da'i, du'at, who are doing da'wah, when they're doing da'wah, they lay their argument of why people should come closer to Islam based off of the logical argument that because it is the truth and because it's essential and XYZ. And I would even argue that say for example, you gave the example of the 80-year-old woman, the percentage of the population that is out to seek the truth for the sake of it being the truth is such a small percentage, right? What is actual human behavior then? Human behavior is that humans will repeat things that quote unquote benefit them, right? And so therefore, I mean, the evidence on this is huge, right? In terms of if you feel that there's a tangible benefit for you, not something that, I mean, dude, like you're telling somebody like, hey, I want you to pray, but this prayer, you're not going to see the reward of it until akhirah.
Right.
Okay. Now, would it be a shock if you framed it that way, that the majority of people would not do that?
That's the exact situation on the ground right now.
Right. Or even, let's say another one, right? So if, for example, you tell people, hey, if you eat a bunch of junk food, you're going to die earlier. Okay. That is within their lifetime that they will see that as a reality, and they still have difficulty in the next, to be able to conceptualize that, to be able to say, okay, in the next 60 years, I'm going to die earlier. What then even worse if you tell somebody, hey, you're not even going to see the reward of this in this life. Right. You're going to see it in the next life. Yeah. People cannot even fathom that, right? Yeah. So then I would then argue is that if you then present the way that I was talking about the taqwa paradigm, if you present Islam, and this is again, I'm going to go a little bit controversial here again, is that if you present it as, hey, yes, there's the akhirah benefit of it. Tika, no problem, right? However, you will actually find that there are extreme tangible benefits on your day-to-day in your health, in your wealth, in your relationships, in your personal life, in your professional life, because of the fact that you prayed with khushu', and praying with khushu' made you a more conscious human being. Being a more conscious human being allowed you to control your anger and make better decisions. And so I kind of joked around, and there's another theory I have called a salah theory, which salah is the ultimate form of becoming into consciousness, because it asks, so there's something called transcendental meditation. Transcendental meditation is some people say is one of the top 3 or 4 meditations you can do, which is basically where it'll elicit the most level of conscious thought that somebody can do. What is transcendental meditation? You basically have the people from the gurus in India or whatever, they came up with this thing. There's a mantra that you repeat. So you sit there for 20 minutes and you repeat this mantra, and because you've repeated the mantra so many times, it's so easy for you to unconsciously say the mantra. So in order to consciously say the mantra, it requires for you to have extreme focus without having to say the thing, because you've said it so many times, because you only have one mantra. Right. So what happens is the transcendental meditation coach, they get licensed for this. Okay, so you get like, you're certified, you can do master transcendental. They give you a mantra. This is a mantra that you stick with for years. But because you've said that mantra so many times, you're more likely to end up saying that mantra unconsciously. Robotically. So the challenge in transcendental meditation, you see what I'm getting at? I know, is that you got to be conscious with it, okay? And this is supposed to be the meditation that's going to elicit the most amount of consciousness, right?
Yeah. It's so funny. It was just so funny the way you kind of, it was like, they take you to a point where you have to say it so much that you become unconscious of it, only to then do it where you have to force yourself to be conscious of it.
Right? So crazy. And so I have a different theory called the salat theory, which if you take, for example, like there's a saying from Imam Abu Hanifa where he would say, that, or rahmatullahi alayhi, that he, before he made a business decision, because he was a businessman, he would pray 2 rak'at salah, right? And so I remember when I was really on this, it was like 4 or 5 years ago, when I was putting this theory together originally, where I said, you know what, subhanAllah, if you do salah properly, it would actually cause you to be in such a heightened state of consciousness that would allow you to actually make better business decisions that would allow you to make more money. And so I remember I was talking to my dad about this, and my dad was like, you got to be careful with the niyyah there, because then you're like, hey, I want to make more money, so I pray salah, right? But technically, in some capacity, there's some kind of connection there. In the same way that if you look at the salah, there's a it's an anecdote, but there's a tabi'i who, I think tabi'i who in a war they had to amputate his leg, and they said, when do you want us to amputate your leg? And again, this is he said, she said, but it was like, oh, do it in salah because that's when I don't feel anything, right? Or this is of course hadith where Bilal radiallahu anh does the adhan, and before he would do the adhan, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would ask, Ya Bilal, comfort us, right? The salah was the sukoon that was providing for. So what is the difference then between our salah and their salah? Now, of course, I'm talking the salah coach over here. So this, I'm sure you're gonna have
references.
No, not only references, but there's a huge amount that we can go into that. But the point being is that if you then explain Islam as a means of which can actually provide you tangible, realistic benefits that you can get into the actual daily world, you then actually get a huge uptick of individuals who say, hey, I want my life to be better. Therefore, I want to become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, I want to become Muslim. Not because I'm going through this logical argument that I'm trying to get the most amount of truth that can happen, which is a very, very, very small percentage of people who are going to say, hey, I'm going to try to find the truth. Majority of people, which is what I led this entire point off.
They just want to live a better life, basically.
They just want to live a better life. And so you can count on humans wanting to live, like you count on humans being humans. Humans will repeat behaviors that give them tangible benefits. If you do not demonstrate to human beings what tangible benefit they are getting by doing these actions, they will not repeat those behaviors.
Right.
So
yeah, man, that's a great point. So again, man, you share so many gems. I'm like, man, how do I even like start commenting? So one thing just off the back of what you just said at the end is a litmus test. Okay, what does the average human being want, right? And if we were to go on the street or just, somewhere, a restaurant, and just asked, surveyed a bunch of people, hey, tell me the top 5 things or 10 things that you would love in your life, And so, and not in terms of tangible, like, material things, but rather just, let's say, intangible things, right? Most people, I think, would probably say something like success, peace, happiness, contentment, fulfillment, love, these types of things. And so if that's what human beings want, right, then I think it goes back to what you're saying, right, is like, does Islam give me that? And that's where, so then the other point on what you were saying about intention is, I think it's important to understand that I think there's almost, I think everything that we do, we can look at it and see multiple intentions behind it, right? Like, I think that's just human nature. And so similarly, when it comes to like the things that we do as Muslims, as believers, like it's okay to have multiple intentions, but hopefully the end goal or the primary intention is, God, basically, to please God, to serve God. So just to quickly finish off the hadith, if you don't mind, the hadith Qudsi is like, it goes on to say, then after you do the obligations, then you can do more, and you do optional things. And then basically the person continues to do these things until I love him, right? If I'm not mistaken, that's what it says. And then basically it goes on to say that then the person's actions, it's like, I think it says like, the person's doing becomes my doing, or something like, it's essentially saying like, hey, whenever he's doing something or looking at something or going somewhere or listening to something, he's doing it as though, or like with the consciousness of like myself, right, as God. So when you were talking about consciousness, right, and just being conscious of God, God is saying that when you get to a point where your love for God is so much, and that happens through doing what he's told you to do, then you get to a point where literally every action you take, you're looking at that action or the response to something that's happening around you through the lens of what does God actually want from me, right? So I think someone called this like, I think it was like the God-centric, like, or God lens or something like that. Basically, like looking at everything through this lens of, okay, what does God actually want me to do?
The reason I laughed was because you said God lens. It sounds like you get like you're playing some video game or something, and you like unlock these glasses, and you're like, I have now achieved.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So, but see, and then even in the Quran, right? So you mentioned prayer. So in the Quran, God understands who He created, right? So He says, for example, so أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. So in general, the remembrance of God or the connection with God, thinking about God, right? That's the only thing that will bring the hearts a sense of rest and peace and contentment and fulfillment, right? So that He's speaking to basically what I just said. If you ask the average human being, what do you want? Mm-hmm. Allah is saying, you want this. This is how you get. This is one of the means or the main means to get it, right? Or for example, He says, "Inna salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar," right? Like indeed, the prayer is a means of tanha. Means tanha is like nihaya, like ending, to stop something, to end something, right? It puts an end to fahsha and munkar, to shamelessness and to evil, right, and wrong things. So Allah in the Quran is always speaking to the human nature, right? He's always speaking to.
And that's where these two evidences that you mentioned, these are the same evidences that the current transactional paradigm will use to say, oh, pray, do more tasbih. But what I think the lacking of that is what is the element of what we talked about in the taqwa paradigm, which is what you have to understand the maqsad through which you can actually then almost quantify what your salah. It is almost like a KPI, right? We talk about it from a business perspective.
Right.
That what is the outcome of your salah?
Right.
And is it actually? I mean, if you really want to get scientific with this, you could then measure neuroplasticity in the brain, because let's say, for example, fahsha and munkar, and you doing some habits or things that you don't want to do, bad habits, right? They would have a specific neurosynaptic pattern in your mind that causes you to repeat those behaviors over and over again. And so by having the khushu' and strengthening your prefrontal cortex and your ability to choose, because what is unique to human beings compared to any other creature on the planet is our ability to choose. What is the part of our brain that actually allows us to choose? Is our prefrontal cortex. What is the part of the brain that consciousness resides within? Is a prefrontal cortex. What is that? These tools actually help us strengthen prefrontal cortex. And so therefore the habits that you might have can be resolved through the neuroplasticity of the brain that is further developed because of the fact that you engage in dhikr and salah. And I think that because we also live in an age in which science and all these, this is the age that we live in, right? Yeah. If you talk to the vast majority of people who are highly intelligent people, if you look at quote unquote, what we say we don't like the labels, but the practicing, the seriousness, whatever label you want to call it, right? Amongst the people who are quote unquote even more like, cognitively there, the people who are, academics, those individuals, they actually end up becoming frivolous people against Islam because of the fact that unfortunately the people who are the spokespeople of Islam are talking to the world as if we are still living 1,000 years ago, in which people still believe that like the reason why I got sick was because some black magic, something happened to me, right? And so there's a whole another segue on this because we got to wrap it up here.
That's a whole other issue.
Because I think that a lot of people, Islam right now is presented as if it is a bunch of superstitious beliefs that is just like this, like I genuinely call it superstition. Like it's just superstitious beliefs. People just have these superstitious beliefs, and we present Islam as if that is the case. But if you present, in my opinion, if you adjust the messaging, we're not adjusting Islam, because Islam is usul, we're adjusting how the messaging is conveyed, and you convey it as there's a neuroscience element to it. It's not just like, dude, even nafs, like the amount of people who go back and say, okay, we got to talk about what Imam Ghazali talked about with nafs. You're talking about in the last hundreds, how many, 500-600 years plus since Imam Ghazali's time, how much more do we understand about psychology, neuroscience, human behavior, all of these things? Are we saying that we got to sit in our halaqat and just continue going through Imam Ghazali's original books on nafs, that he didn't have the access to that? At some point, I start to argue that all we're doing is just continuing the same, like, oh, he said this, so therefore, da 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 da. But the truth is that if you present the messaging in a way that is actually up to date with what is appealing to the people who are interested in these things, I think that you have a better impact in how you actually quantify it. So to wrap up here, I think the last piece of this that I think is important to talk about is everything we talked about. The reason I think that it's very important is because going back to that original quote that I said is that if you have an hour to solve a problem, you spend 55 minutes figuring out what the problem is.
Yes.
If somebody's knee is hurting, and the reason their knee is hurting, you do knee surgery on that, and then all of a sudden you end up with a jacked up knee because you did knee surgery and you replaced their knee, when in reality it's because their hip was misaligned because of their ball and socket joint that was causing their knee to hurt, and their quads. Point being is that when you address the wrong problem, you go down such a rabbit hole in which you end up hurting the outcome that you were looking to do. And so the point of this being is that I don't think that Muslims in today's world, those who are the leaders of doing da'wah, truly actually understand why Muslims are the way they are. And they will just say, oh man, this is time of the days of judgment. Which, don't get me started on that. There's a whole another thing is like, oh, so mashallah, how the time scales of which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does, you don't want to say plans or, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't use these same words. But point being is that the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees time is not the way that we as humans see time. We as humans are like, oh, this is the day of judgment. It could go on for another million years, and day of judgment could be a million years from now. So point being is that I think that most of the people who are trying to work for the deen, I don't doubt that they have the good intention. What I would urge, if I was to go back into the deen scene, and if that was the primary thing that I was going to do again, which inshallah, bi'idhnillah, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives me life, I will return to that one day, is that to first take a look at what are the root causes of why people are the way that they are, and not to be standing on the khutbah and being like, I can't tell you how many, you Muslim this, this, and you're just like berating them, attacking them.
It's only making it worse.
It's only making it worse.
Because then the guilt is building up, right?
The guilt is building up, and guilt and shame and judgment are the three most destructive emotions that a human being can feel, because it withers away their capacity to do anything else. And so the amount of, in this transactional paradigm of Islam that we have, the amount of guilt and judgment and shame that has built up within the entire Muslim ummah is so much, which eventually these people say, hey, I can't take the guilt and shame anymore. I'm just going to abandon this whole thing called Islam, because of the fact that all they do is just shame me, they just judge me, I just feel bad all the time. And then that's when you get all of the people who are like, yeah, but you know what, I don't want to say that public capacity, but XYZ person is love. I'm not going to say, there's other faiths, other faiths would be like, I'm not going to say it publicly, but like, XYZ person, it's all about love. And like, yes, thank you. Somebody says love, it's about love, because these guys, all they do is judge and shame me and guilt me. And all of it comes down to, in my opinion, because of the transactional versus whatever word we got to come up with for the taqwa paradigm.
Yeah, man. How much time do we have left, by the way?
Probably got to wrap in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, man. It's I know I'm always throwing out references, but I feel like it's necessary.
By the way, it's 2:35.
That's fine. I got 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the verse in which Allah says, "Alam ya'ni lilladhina amanu an takhsha'a qulubuhum li dhikrillah," right? Like, isn't it time yet for the believers, or for those who believe, that their hearts should find, be in awe, an takhsha'a qulubuhum, like their hearts should be in awe, should be in such a state, right? Like being moved, li dhikrillah, at the remembrance of God, or at the connection with God, and what was sent out from the truth, وَمَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ وَلَا يَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ مِنْ قَبْلِ, and do not be like those who were given the scripture from before. فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ, a long time passed, فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُم, right? وَكَثِيرٌ مِنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ, and their hearts hardened, right? I feel like that advice is so critical, because I think we're at a point where, people's hearts need to be awakened, basically. And the way in the Quran it's described is like, you have two groups of people who were given scriptures from before. One of them went hard line on all the rules and the commandments, right? And we're told not to be like them because they lost the heart. And then another group are so passionate and so heartfelt, right? Love, etc. But then
all your sins forgiven, no matter what you do, right. You've been saved.
But then rules, we don't care. What are rules, right? Like, you don't even need to do anything. You just, if you believe something, then you're salvation, right? So Islam is basically a balance between these two things. And man, I think it's really going back to the basics. And like you were saying, it's about just looking at what the root problem is. Like that quote that you said was very, very powerful. Often I think it's there's another quote or another kind of analogy. It's like, it's not about speed, it's about direction, right? Meaning that I think right now we're facing the wrong direction, so to speak. But we're going, sometimes some people are going at a good speed, but it doesn't really matter if you're not going in the right direction. So we need to kind of, hone it back a little bit and think, like you said, root cause analysis, like what are the root causes? And I think a lot of it we touched on today, like we have like these 6 principles basically as part of like what the work that I'm doing. One of which is like quality over quantity, another is like mindfulness over, mindlessness, and so on and so forth. So, man, this has been a great discussion. I wish we had a longer time, but I think just as I always like to also end on a practical note, so I don't know how many people are going to watch this, who's going to watch this, but I think the practical thing is just to kind of go back to the foundations and realize that, think about like the intention, and sort of the substance and the essence, the benefit to oneself in this life, and how Islam basically, I feel like, whatever level of attention it is, right? Whether it's at the individual level, whether it's at the family level, whether it's at the societal level, or whether it's just at the kind of just in general, right? Or in the afterlife, even, like, you know, putting aside this life, just even the afterlife, obviously, like it has the solutions and it has the answers, right? But I feel like you said, it's more about the paradigm. It's about the positioning. Like, it's about the, you know, in marketing we have, like, you know, the way you position something, it can completely change whether a person buys or not. Similarly, like, you know, we are not positioning the most beautiful thing that we have. We're not positioning it in the right way. And so people who even have it actually don't even know that it's the most beautiful thing that you know, that exists. So yeah, hopefully we can play a part in, you know, being a part of the solution and not being a part of the problem, and hopefully this is a small step towards that, inshallah.
There's a whole another controversial thing I have, so I think I'll talk about in the podcast episode, and we'll close off with this. I have a quote. I think Islam does not have all the answers, and there's a whole,
I think I need to step away now.
And then there's a whole that'll be for part 2, or we'll have to go into the, I think I talked about it in the previous podcast episode, but as you can see, I just come up with like some like controversial clickbait, like, what,
bro? If you had a video on YouTube that said Islam does not have all the answers, bro, like,
or like the halaqah you're attending is actually hurting you more than
yeah, exactly,
like that, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, all right, inshallah. So I guess I'm torn always between the audience that we talk to, whether or not it ends up being the quote unquote serious audience, because obviously you tell when the audience is serious, like, let's end with the subhanakallahumma bihamdik, versus that sometimes also then the other 80%, I want to say it kind of puts them off. Now the people who be quote unquote more serious be like, forget it, puts them off. We end with the name of Allah. And then you get both sides of it. Kind of alludes to, before we started recording, you're like, man, just having like a moderate stance nowadays is impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
What to do in the middle. Yeah. So whatever way we're going to end, I guess Jazakallah khair, Brother Farzan, for coming on, and inshallah look forward to part 2 as well.
Thanks for having me, man. It's been a pleasure.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.